Looks like we're about a minute in, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Northwest ATTC webinar. I'm Jennifer Verbeck, and I'm your host for today. We're excited to have Dr. Gary Ferguson, who is a licensed naturopathic doctor and healthy communities consultant living in Anchorage, Alaska. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that here at the ATTC, we believe that language matters and words have power. We strive to be culturally informed and inclusive and really value your feedback on how we're doing. Please email us at northwest@attcnetwork.org if you have any comments or suggestions. A couple of quick housekeeping things. First, if you have any questions for Dr. Ferguson during the presentation, please type them into the chat box down below at any time. After he's done speaking, I'll read the questions so he can answer them. You'll also be getting an email at the end of today's webinar with a link to a survey in it, so please take that survey. It helps us make sure we're bringing you the content you're interested in. That email will also have a link to download the slides from today and a link to our website where you'll be able to find a recording of the webinar. And that should be available later this afternoon. Additionally, we'll be sending everyone who attends the live webinar a certificate of attendance, and that takes us about a week. You don't need to do anything to get the certificate unless you're watching this in a group. In that case, please have someone in the group email us within a business day with the names and email addresses for everyone who wants a certificate. And again, our email is northwest@attcnetwork.org on the screen there. Okay, now on to the webinar. As mentioned earlier, today's speaker is Dr. Gary Ferguson, who is a facilitator, motivational speaker, health coach, and technical consultant to communities and agencies around how to address contributing factors to health and well-being. He is Aleutian Unungan, originally from the Shumagan Islands community of Sandpoint, Alaska. Dr. Ferguson's past positions include providing clinical services to his home region of Eastern Aleutian tribes, serving as the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium as Senior Director of Community Health Services, and CEO at the Rural Alaska Community Action Program. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gary Ferguson.
Good morning. This is Gary Ferguson calling in from Sitka, Alaska, where we have some liquid sunshine coming down. Today, beautiful day here. Love being able to be here, and following this workshop, I get to go speak at Sitka High School and Mount Edgecombe High School, which is a huge honor to work with our next generation. And I'll be talking about that because I really feel like as we look at moving upstream to address the current addiction crisis, we need to really have a special focus on our youth, and focus on prevention is really where it's at. And I'm just going to do a quick check. Are you hearing me okay, staff?
Yep.
Okay, great. And then as far as the slides, I'm able to advance the slides.
You just click on the screen once with your mouse, and then you should be able to advance from there.
Okay, great. There we go. Okay, so this is where I'm from. This is the beautiful community of Sandpoint. We're a fishing town, and growing up here, I really feel especially blessed to have the elders, the community that surrounded me to help me become the person that I am today. And I just want to give a shout out to my hometown of Sandpoint. Beautiful place, and I miss it. I don't get there very often anymore. So the town of Sandpoint has come together along with the region recently in addressing the addiction challenges. And it started with a big public event that happened several years ago, where the community came down to the airport, where a suspected drug dealer had been coming into the community and dealing opioids primarily, but other substances. And they met him at the airport and told him, here's your one-way ticket out, don't ever come back. because the town and the region, and of course it's a worldwide issue when we look at the opioid epidemic that we have right now, facing our young people, that many are dying a premature death. And in Sandpoint and in our Aleutian Pribilof Island region, we've had some very sad stories and mortality events, deaths that were due to opioids. And so the community, the region is coming together. And when we look at how we got here, I'm always interested in like what, first off, what can we do about it? But how did we get here in the first place? And when we look at the challenges of prescribing patterns, I've worked primarily in the Alaska tribal health system. And when you look at some of our issues that we're facing, they didn't just appear. One of the things that I learned early on as I started my work in the tribal health system in 2003, I was consulting at South Central Foundation at the Alaska Native Medical Center. And we were looking at prescribing patterns of the physicians and mid-level providers. And what came up as the most prescribed medication in 2003, 2004 was hydrocodone in the opioid class. And, you know, when we look at that was so many years ago already. And where we're at right now, of course, we've had opioid review committees. We've had different ways that we've addressed opioids. But when we look at the influence of big pharma, FDA, some very insidious factors have come into play related to opioids and other medications. But when we look at the current addiction crisis, it's been brewing for a long time, and we need to follow it upstream. So as I shared, our region came together in 2014 to have a substance abuse summit with concerned community members, tribal leaders, government leaders, state of Alaska partners, Alaska Tribal Health System partners, all coming together to say, what can we do and how can we help the region address this addiction crisis? And during the presentations, on day one, there was a really poignant story that was told from former trooper Joe Masters when he showed up in Perryville, Alaska, which is near Sandpoint. And he was speaking with Father Harry Kaikalkanak, who said, are you here to help us or to save us? And when we look at community-based approaches and helping communities to be healthy places and address their challenges, what was really brought up as far as in that story was that we need to work with the community on what works for the community and have community stakeholders always at the table. This learned helplessness issue has been long-standing, that the Indian Health Service had come into our communities and, we're here to fix you. And often it wasn't community-based solutions or things that were as effective as they could have been had they enlisted the community to really come together to say, what can we all do to address this? And is this really going to work in our community? As a naturopathic physician, I use philosophy every single day when I do my work. And when we think of the philosophy of naturopathic medicine, of course, we say first, do no harm. And that's not just naturopathic medicine, it's all medicine. That's the Hippocratic Oath. We focus on doing the least harm, or ideally doing no harm. And another one is doctor as teacher. And I feel like as a physician, my role is to teach and educate and empower people to take control of their own health, as well as when I work in community, for the community to really look at what can they do to have sustainable health systems, have preventive approaches that are upstream and that they are employing rather than always coming up with the outside expert or somebody coming in to fix them. And also another philosophy, a principle that I really appreciate is to treat the whole person and really look at a mind, body, and spiritual aspect as well, which often we're as providers, we're afraid to talk about sometimes the spiritual aspects of health and well-being. But I think it's when we look at the current addiction crisis, I feel like it's a deeply spiritual issue as well. And I'll go into that in my presentation today. There's also a concept called a therapeutic order, which I use as a way to talk about when we think of treating pain, for example, which when we think of the prescribing patterns of opioids, pain was and has been one of the common reason why we will prescribe opioids. And within the therapeutic order, Medications, pharmaceuticals are at the top. They're to be employed later in therapy if need be. First off, you want to establish the foundation for health. You want to support the body's innate healing ability. For example, a fever, when you have a fever, the fever is the body's natural response to a pathogen or to a process that's going on. And yes, fevers can go too high, but just pulling out the Tylenol every time you have a fever of 99 or 100 is blunting the possible therapeutic effects of the fever. And so I feel like when we think of our bodies as this incredible organism that self-regulates, and when given the proper support, it can heal itself. And correcting structural integrity, nutrient therapy, food as medicine concepts, and then we look at employing pharmaceuticals and surgery, and of course, when you have your accident or emergency, that you have a broken bone, you go into the ER and you have your therapeutic treatments there, surgeries or whatever is needed. But when it comes to mentally, emotional, spiritual well-being, often we need to look at correcting structural integrity and helping the body heal itself first before we employ medications. And one of the other big principles is to treat the root cause. And as we move upstream to treat the root cause regarding addiction, I want to start with some of the materials that the Alaska Resilience Initiative, this is something I want to give a big shout out. There's the web resource for this initiative that provides training to educators, to health systems, to policymakers around trauma-informed, trauma-responsive approaches. And so I want to start with that because I feel like that's one area that health systems need to focus on more, being trauma-informed and ideally healing-centered. And one of the basic premises of the trainings within the Alaska Resilience Initiative is in trauma-informed care that the memory of our early experiences is stored in our brains and our bodies, not just in our brains, and not just through cognitive behavioral therapy, but often somato-emotional approaches are very, very helpful in addressing trauma. And when we look at trauma in Alaska and across, this is an international phenomenon due to colonization, but when we look at the history of colonization, there's epidemics, there's been a loss of culture due to boarding schools and different philosophies by the US government and interventions, kill the Indian, save the man. When we think of our indigenous communities, there's been a lot of trauma in our indigenous communities. And when we think of historical trauma, I'm in Southeast Alaska today. This is a sign that was outside of the Baranoff Hotel in Juneau, well into the 60s. So racism has been rampant, and the current generation of adults have experienced racism and still experience racism as historical trauma currently, as well as in the past generation trauma. And one thing that I've been unpacking lately, as I think more deeply into colonialism and the trauma from colonization, I was watching this show on Netflix called The Heist, and this concept of Stockholm syndrome, where you fall in love with your captor, or the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn part of a situation when you are faced with being held captive. You end up sometimes fawning or falling in love or working with your captor in a way where you take on their belief system. And I feel like in many of our communities, this explains some of the going against your own culture and going against the things that could also be very, very healing for you because of the colonized thought and this thought that where my grandmother, Marina Gunderson, who is also Alairdunagan, she went to boarding school in Eklutna, which is outside of Anchorage, and left her home region that's 700 plus miles away, and was there for 5 years before returning home. And when she got home after completing high school, her own mother said, "Is that the new school teacher?" Because she was so Western, and during boarding school, she had the trauma of boarding school where she was not able to speak Unangam Tinu, our Aleut language. She wasn't able to eat traditional foods. And she was taught that the culture of indigenous people was bad, and the goal was to assimilate. And so that trauma persists in through all that have experienced boarding schools, and often the generational effects of being away from your culture and parenting skills, cultural values. It's left a generational trauma. And I feel like the Stockholm Syndrome aspect, to me, I think is fascinating. And I haven't found a whole lot written in the indigenous people of America, but this Philam journal is very compelling. And when we look at trauma moving through the generations, it definitely affects multiple generations. And some of the studies on animals have showed at least 3 generations, 4 generations. And when we look at the research with people who have survived the Holocaust, there's a blunted stress response in many of the family members that have survived the Holocaust. And then the subsequent generations have this inherent stress response blunted in their bodies as well. And so we have this carried over into multiple generations. And Dr. Angela Michaud, when we were listening to a lecture on historical trauma, made this photo of, or drawing rather, and really portraying the eggs of that are within a woman are there from birth. And so the experiences that she goes through are literally experienced by a part of her next generation, should she have children. And I feel like, to me, it's fascinating, and it's also very important when we look at pregnancy and environments for women who are having our next generations, to where we can have safety and address things early on. When if we can prevent domestic violence or stress, we can help our next generations be healthier. And of course, when we think of stress and trauma, we also need to also remember the resilience that many of us are currently experiencing because of our ancestors and civil rights pioneers, people who have led the way. That's also within us. And here in Southeast Alaska, Elizabeth Baratovich is very famous and across the state, and as one who stood up and exercised her resilience and her strength. Harold Napoleon, this is a great read for if you work with indigenous populations talking about historical trauma. Harold Napoleon himself experienced incredible trauma growing up, historical trauma, and has been resilient through a lot of painful experiences. So a great read. But he writes about the importance, like when we look at communities, a healthy village is a circle whose people are safe within its folds. Having the community be a place of healing. And when communities are fractured, broken by trauma, that affects generations, and the whole sustainability of the community will be threatened. So there was a really compelling study with mice looking at historical trauma, and basically they gave these mice a strong chemical smell and a electrical shock, and eventually the mice became accustomed to that. So where they had the smell, they would shiver expecting the shock. And what was really fascinating was these mice had babies, and those babies who had never experienced the shock or the smell, when given the smell, they shivered. So one generation. And then those mice had babies, and the mice were given the strong smell, and they also shivered. So 2 generations removed are still having experiences and a reaction to something that their ancestors went through. And so to me, I feel like this starts to help explain some of the behavior that sometimes we don't even understand why we react to certain things. I was just in Huntsville, Alabama recently, and was speaking with a gentleman, a person of color, who was talking about the continued racism that still exists in the South. And, when you look at that, whether even if it's a generation removed, sometimes a reaction to law enforcement or to certain situations, we don't even understand that, or maybe the stress, and then when you compound that, it becomes complex. it helps us understand certain communities and how they've got historical trauma, they've got intergenerational aspects, and then of course we add to that adverse childhood experiences and current trauma in this lifetime. It starts to add up, and it starts to explain why certain people are more prone to going down the journey of addiction and self-medication. So speaking of adverse childhood experiences, I wanted to briefly touch on ACEs. I know that many of you on the call today have had training already in adverse childhood experiences, so I'll go fairly rapidly through this. And of course, the slides and anything that I've covered, if it was a little fast, you'll be able to have the slides for further research. But basically, the ACEs study, large study, Kaiser Permanente, 17,000 patients. And what they found was that adverse childhood experiences were common. Abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, 10 total ACEs that they measured. They found that where one ACE occurs, there are usually others occurring together with that ACE, adverse childhood experience, and that health problems. There was a dose-response relationship. The more adverse childhood experiences that you experience, the more likely that you would have health problems. And for example, I've done a lot of work in tobacco prevention and control. And to me, when I look at a young person, especially a very young person, smoking or using cigarettes or vaping, I start to think of, what happened to you? Has something happened to you? Is there something we need to work on? Or is there something we need to help you heal? Because it's one where there's definitely a higher likelihood that you'll start smoking earlier as far as initiation, to be a current smoker, as well as suffer the effects of smoking with a high adverse childhood experience score. And also risk behavior, sexual risk behavior, likelihood for ever injected drugs or an STI. Liver disease, of course, the consequences of lifestyles of self-medication affect your liver. And this, to me, is also a really compelling statistic here between 3 ACEs and 4 ACEs. And I want you to take note of that, because I'm going to share some of the Alaska data in particular, but the marked increase from 3 ACEs to 4 ACEs in suicidality or suicide attempts. And then also when we look at, public health and obesity, eating patterns, people who've had complex trauma and adverse childhood experiences, and the likelihood of being severely obese go up, as well as the consequences often of obesity with diabetes and the stress connected to diabetes in the background. In a host of medical conditions, of course, it's not one for one, but I always, as a physician, look at people who have chronic conditions and making sure that are we addressing the trauma underneath many of our chronic conditions. There's been a dramatic rise in systemic lupus in the state of Alaska. And to me, I think of trauma and healing trauma as a way to help patients manage lupus and autoimmune disease, as well as, again, moving upstream to prevent it. And also risk for cancer. Cancer is on the rise in many of our communities, and addressing complex trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and healing is a great way to also address cancer prevention as well. So here's a quote from Dr. Rita Blumenstein, one of my amazing friends and mentors, teachers. She has contributed so greatly to our health in Alaska and across the world as a 13 Indigenous grandmother. And she quotes, pregnancy is when children get their first knowledge. If a mother is able to eat well, be active, and attend ceremonies and dances in a peaceful environment, the child develops well. If there is conflict or violence between the mother and the father, this will harm the child. And, very wise words. We understand that now in many different ways, from a biological as well as a spiritual way. And when we look at ACEs, there's been many states collecting adverse childhood experience data. Alaska data shows very similar to the study at Kaiser Permanente that about a third of Alaskans didn't experience any of those 10 ACEs that they scored, but almost 1 in 4 Alaskans had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And so I pair that with our current suicidality and youth suicide risk. I pair that with our current addiction trends. And it's one where as we start to heal the trauma and move upstream and address early on trauma, I feel that we're going to start to get ahead of the addiction crisis that's upon us right now, as well as other chronic diseases. We know that other chronic diseases have a huge correlation to unresolved adverse childhood experiences or trauma: arthritis, asthma, kidney disease, and limited activity due to health problems, depressive disorders. And again, look at that difference between 2 and 3 ACEs and 4 ACEs. Dramatic difference. And again, it's one of those where, we can medicate depression or anxiety, but without proper treatment and behavioral health support and the healing of trauma, I feel it's malpractice, truly malpractice. And again, there's also direct correlation between poverty and people who've experienced poverty and adverse childhood experiences, food security. And of course, one of the beautiful things about the brain and what we know about the brain and the body is that the body wants to heal. The body wants to maintain homeostasis. And I feel like that's the hope. The training at the Alaska Resilience Initiative is called History and Hope. And focusing on the hope to me is one of the most important pieces. What can we actually do about it? And there's some really great resources. This is a talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris on TED Med that if you haven't watched it, you should watch it. She's the new Surgeon General for the state of California and is doing amazing work. And she also has a book that she's collected some of her thoughts and ideas around healing trauma. And one of the beautiful things about the adverse childhood experience study was that patients who had high adverse childhood experience scores were given just a 1 hour consult with a psychiatrist. And in that hour, the psychiatrist basically said, I see that you have this adverse childhood experience and this one and this one and this one and this one. And up until now in your life, how have these affected your life? And for many people, that was the first time they talked about that in a way that someone acknowledged. They actually were heard. And what was really powerful was that in the subsequent 2 years after the 1 hour session with the psychiatrist, there was a 2/3 reduction in doctor office visits. So people were less anxious and had less urgency with their health issues. And so, again, it's like that powerful moment of actually being heard. And in our healthcare system, the referral to behavioral health, spending extra time as a provider with your patients so that they feel heard. It's a powerful way to help them heal and address trauma. First off, screening and addressing that as well, adverse childhood experiences. And when we look at hope, there's been amazing stories of cultural strength and resilience. In this case, here's some of our Unaga dancers who were at Culture Camp at Sandpoint, and we have a resurgence of our culture in our region, which is really beautiful after over 100 years of no dance due to colonization. We now have hundreds of young people who are involved in culture camps every year, and also a revival of our dance. And to me, that speaks of resilience, and it speaks of healing in very deep ways, including spiritual ways. And across communities, there is deep healing happening through ceremony and resiliency through cultural practices. And truly, culture is medicine. And as Dr. Rita shares, when we heal ourselves, we heal our ancestors. And I feel like the understanding of how trauma gets transmitted through generations, as we heal ourselves, we truly are helping our ancestors heal things that often they didn't get to in their lifetime. Here's a great read by Dr. Eduardo Duran. If you work with indigenous populations, and even if you don't, this is a great read, just really looking at historical trauma, soul level healing. Powerful book. And when we look at healing here, this is a Southeast. This was on a canoe journey. Got to paddle from Cake to Juneau one year, and the power of ceremony, the power of drumming. Dr. Michelle Conjon, who's a Navajo PhD nurse. She is doing research on ceremony in Navajo traditions and has seen incredible results of ceremony. Just even one ceremony will lower stress, inflammatory biomarkers, qualitative aspects of healing and mental, emotional, spiritual well-being. And so I feel like more and more we're starting to understand that our cultural practices truly are medicinal. They're healing, and they're healing on many levels, not just on a mental or emotional level, but also on physical levels. And again, I spoke of trauma informed, and I really think our health systems need to move to being healing centered, trauma responsive in their ways. And this is an article from last year looking at this quote. It says, "The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is genuine, meaningful interactions and authentic connections and experiences with ourselves, each other, and the world around us." Really powerful quote. And, when we look at resiliency and encouraging resiliency with our youth and our next generations, there's some really powerful ways that we can address that through counter adverse childhood experiences, having good friends and neighbors, beliefs that provide comfort, liking school, teachers who care, who show up. And I feel like that's been a part of my resiliency. I had some really amazing teachers who stayed with me from 6th grade all the way through my high school education in various capacities. My coach, my music instructor, Noreen Steinbrecher, my coach, Dan Career, just giving them shout outs because they showed up and they were there to support me. And I feel like our educational systems, and I know in Alaska, many of our communities have such turnover with our teachers that people don't have those longer term relationships and support. And I feel like that's something we also need to move upstream and work on, is having those relationships. They're so powerful. Having a caregiver whom you feel safe with, opportunities to have fun with our children, and helping, joy, helping them have joy in their life, feeling comfortable with yourself, a predictable home routine like regular meals and bedtimes. And this is one in Alaska and many of our northern cities. In the summer, it's 24 hours of sunlight in many of our communities, or at least a majority of the day. And, you still have to have a regular bedtime and have some structure, because that helps hold our youth and makes them feel safe. And there's just a quote just talking about counter ACEs, and that counter ACEs maybe and most likely are more powerful than the adverse childhood experiences or historical trauma themselves. And this is just a reference, the People Awakening Project. Folks at Center for Alaska Health Research did a project in Southwest Alaska looking at culture and cultural practices, and found that youth who were a part of those cultural practices had greater resiliency and had less risk behavior. So culture is truly medicine. And I've had the honor of working in our culture camps over the years in the Aleutian Bluff Island region. And I see it time and time again. Youth who are involved in these culture camps are more resilient. Doesn't mean that they don't have lumps and bumps. And again, back to historical trauma and the things that we have to heal in our lifetime. But the fact is culture and cultural practices truly are healing, and on so many levels, including the food as medicine concepts. And they're in line with our traditional values of our cultures in Alaska and Pacific Northwest, across the Americas. We have powerful traditional practices. And for my own Unangat values, I have one that is especially beautiful. Life is gifted to you. What you make of it is your gift in return. And the importance of living with and respecting the land, sea, and all nature, being connected to that environment. In Japan, they have a concept called forest bathing, which of course now has come across the globe in influence, along with Marie Kondo and sparking joy. But the forest bathing and getting outside in nature, and the health benefits, even 15 minutes in nature is so profoundly healing and lowering your blood pressure and helping you experience well-being. And it's something that many of us in our nature deficit environment, due to devices and school systems who are cutting recess and playtime. I mean, I feel like we need to really push back on that agenda, and our kids need nature. Our kids need to be involved in being outside. That nature truly is healing. And I want to mention Maslow's hierarchy. I use this a lot in my training and teaching, and also perspective as we work in community, that we need to create safety, address housing, safe water, sanitation. I mean, all those are public health approaches, but they create a terrain that allows for self-actualization and healing. And of course, Maslow, great model, but what isn't well known about Maslow's hierarchy is that actually he worked with the Blackfoot Nation to develop his model. And so the Maslow's hierarchy is actually an indigenous model coming from the Blackfoot Nation, where they go way beyond self-actualization, because they basically say everything that Maslow talked about to be self-actualized, but also moving way beyond that self-actualization leads to community actualization. And if you want cultural perpetuity, it's dependent on your community being self-actualized and community being actualized together. That creates cultural perpetuity and a healthy future generation. In Alaska, across our great nation, tribes are coming together. This is Nakantugudo, the Dena'ina language, and Kenaiti tribe, and some of the work that they're doing to reclaim culture and language. And it's a really profound healing that's happening as a result of Nakantugudo means the tide is returning. And I really feel like it's such a hopeful time for tribal nations and for all of us as we look at the deeper healing that needs to happen, that the current trends, the addiction crisis, those are symptoms of deeper issues that are deeply spiritual, and we need to heal those wounds. This is a picture of the late Alma Cook here in Southeast Alaska, from Prince of Wales Island, and just the messages that she has of joy and having joy in every day and having humor. There's such beautiful values from our cultures. And our current practices, getting out and being involved in canoe journey and paddling. And these cultural practices are not only wonderful physical activity, just good for your body, but also deeply healing on a spiritual level as we connect with ancestral traditions. And as we look at intergenerational connectedness, many of our cultures across Alaska, Pacific Northwest and beyond, we've got some really amazing ways to be connected. And again, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. And I look at our indigenous cultures and the beautiful values that are a part of the matrix of our ancestral wisdom, things that we value, elders and being outside, survival skills, participation in our cultural activities. There are so many things that we can do to be connected. This is the work of and collection of Dr. Laverne Demientieff at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And as we look at connection, there's definitely, this is Edith Nagiak from Utqiagvik, and she's sharing with our young people and the generations how to pick Sura, which is the diamond-leaf willow, a wonderful nutrient-dense plant, as well as a healing plant. And when I think of practices like this and teaching generationally and having elders be a part of your life and listening to them, having them integrated in your culture, this is domestic violence prevention. This is suicide prevention. And when you think of this is well-being, and it's one that many of us in our busy lives, our elders are getting put in assisted living homes and aren't valued the way that they should be on a cultural level. And I feel like that's something that we need to fix. In naturopathic medicine, there's a principle called vis medicatrix naturae, which is that nature is medicine, and as a part of that, food is medicine. And that's something that this is a whole talk that we gave recently at the Alaska Addiction Professionals Association on nutrition and addiction. And I was at the NADAC conference, the National Addiction Professionals Conference, and I did a straw poll, and I said, how many of you have nutrition as a part of your addiction program? And only a handful raised their hand. And I said, how many of you integrate integrative providers like acupuncture, naturopaths, chiropractors as a part of your team for pain management and well-being, a handful. And so I feel like there's so much we can do as we move upstream. That nutrition is huge. And when we think of nutrition, neurotransmitters, the production of neurotransmitters, we can affect them and tweak them with serotonin reuptake inhibitors and other kinds of medications in the brain. But when we think of where they're formed and the nutrition underneath them, we have to address the deficiency. And many of our clients, people who are going through the addiction journey, are very depleted. And if we're not addressing nutrition, we're completely missing. Again, it's malpractice. And case in point, vitamin D. There was a question about vitamin D levels in Alaska Native people, and there was some recent research looking at the specimen bank, and basically from the 60s to present, we looked at vitamin D levels. People thought that they were naturally low. Well, actually, we found that they were very high and very healthy traditionally in the 60s and 70s, and then there's been a precipitous decline. And this slide refers to a nitrogen isotope, which is a proxy for traditional food. And so basically, it's declined. Vitamin D levels have declined because we're not eating like we used to. We're not eating like our ancestors. And when we think of one of the biggest suppliers of vitamin D, or one of the best sources, is actually salmon. And, I always like to say, what do elders love? Alaska Native elders, they love salmon head soup, halibut heads. And, that's, the healthy fats and the vitamin D nutrition is there. And so, vitamin D, very important. And when you look at not only the food, but also the skills, connecting with nature, self-sufficiency, it's deeply healing. And a program while I was at the Alaskan Tribal Health Consortium we created called Store Outside Your Door, which there's a YouTube link here if you want to see like how to hunt, fish, gather, and grow your own food and connect with nature, connect with your food system. Very important. For young people, I'm here in Sitka, and they have a couple of really great programs here. Wilderness therapy for teens who are at risk is very powerful. And a couple of the programs, giving shout outs to Alaska Crossings and Ravens Way here at Southeast Alaska Regional Health Consortium. Really amazing programs that are truly best practices in getting youth outside, connecting with nature, connecting with themselves. And others around the state of Alaska, a couple wonderful ones that have had great results. Work at Tanana Chiefs Conference, the Old Minto Family Recovery Camp, family-based, community-based solutions that can help us address addictions and treat family systems, and understanding that that's also a huge part of well-being and future well-being. A shout out to Cook Inlet Tribal Council and the work they're doing with the new Ernie Turner Center, which they're going to be offering a lot more holistic-based treatments, including nutrition, food as medicine. And when you look at community-based approaches, Igiaga in Alaska, they took a six-week traditional food challenge and found people lost weight, their blood pressure normalized, they got off their diabetes meds. And, when you're looking at holistic approaches to healing, it's not just about not using substances, but it's also about having a body that's in balance, having a community that supports each other. And, these are beautiful examples and also challenges for our communities that are more challenged. And of course, those of us who live in more urban settings, a little bit more difficult, but we can do it by communities, smaller groups of people, neighborhoods. In Southwest Alaska, at Monarch, a Center for Alaska Health Research project focused on traditional foods, and here we're making salmon with our youth, helping them know how to cook to start with. A fish to school program with Cookback, and the community came together and supported the young people in a traditional chef, kind of an Iron Chef cook-off of preparing salmon. Again, salmon very rich in vitamin D, and getting our kids turned on to healthy food. Again, prevention. Helping our young people have assets and resiliency, encouraging that resiliency, and of course a little bit of Dr. Seuss and our traditional foods, moose meat. When we look at addictions and nutrition, it's not been just a short time. It's been, this book's been out, Liz Scott's book on Sober Kitchen. We know what you eat affects your sobriety and also your relapse. And so programs need to address nutrition, and there's some really great resources around nutrition and alcoholism, as well as other substances that deplete your body of key nutrients. And along with that comes the changes in the microbiome. Again, in your guts, as far as like more serotonin is produced in your body, in your gut, than in your brain. So as you address your gut health, and the metaphor, what does your gut say? Truly is true on so many levels as far as nutrition, and that's something that there's a couple of great resources: Brainmaker, Dr. Perlmutter, and The Good Gut, Justin Sonnen and Eric Sonnenberg. And as I close, I've just got a couple more minutes left here, but there's been some really great movement here in Alaska with a combination of some of my naturopathic colleagues, Cameron O'Connell, and Dr. Abby Lang, and then also Michael De Molina and Wisdom Traditions Counseling. We're putting together programs that are more holistic to address opiate addiction and also alcohol addiction, that include holistic protocols. And this is something that we're working on, and sometimes insurance or third-party payers will only pay for certain pieces. So we're looking at creative ways to have all of these pieces that are more holistic practices to address not only the opiate detox and helping patients get off the substance, but also helping them heal holistically. Again, choosing the right tool. There's a big difference between a pipe wrench and a torque wrench. And, often a pipe wrench is like a Stilton wrench. And for those that aren't mechanical, it's a big beast of a tool compared to a torque wrench that's used for small micro adjustments. And often in healthcare and other settings, we don't do things that really are aligned with promoting well-being. We bring in the big guns right at the beginning rather than helping address the body and help the body heal itself. And just to shout out to a couple of other programs that have really influenced me: Central City Concern in Portland, the holistic nature of addressing social and economic determinants, the NADA protocol that they have for addiction treatment. Acupuncture is a powerful tool to employ in your addiction treatment programs. And that the shout out to NADAC. This is a training. If you're a member, you can have access to this training free online. And it uses this ancient tool of acupuncture that can help patients recover, and it can assist them on their journey to well-being, and relapse prevention as well as well-being. Another tool at NADA, you can get the training ocudetox.com. And of course, Mindbody approaches are really powerful, and mindfulness, and combining them with acupuncture, you have even a better outcome. And the importance of ceremony, I mentioned Dr. Michelle Kahn-John, and ceremony. I can't speak about ceremony and the power of ceremony healing more. I think that we need to have more of it in our treatment programs. And another shout out to another cool program, Northwest Indian Treatment Centers treatment program, which is holistic, and all of the folks that made that happen. Squaxin Island Tribe employs this program that it has cultural elements in healing, herbal teas that participants in the program can self-medicate in a healthy way for anxiety and for holistic ways to help them address what's going on health-wise. Food as medicine concepts, and being connected to your food is deeply healing. And of course, the power of medicine through food. And here's a great read. This is an article for future reading that looks at other naturopathic therapies that include botanicals to help with treating addiction. And a shout out to Dr. Jillian Stansbury and her work on this article, as well as continue to work in addiction treatment. And there's some great research looking at even the combining of these holistic treatments of botanicals and some of our current pharmaceutical treatments, that there's improved results. And addressing the nutrient deficiencies, I think is really important. Some really great resources there, as well as energy psychology. So powerful when you look at helping people heal and helping them have tools that they can employ from a mindfulness perspective, and helps them along their way and their whole journey, not just from the addiction perspective, but also true mental emotional well-being. And I like to always teach folks a couple tools. Here's a simple tool for anxiety and panic. It uses acupressure point, and you can do it covertly. And there we go. So mindfulness powerful for our youth. This is a great video on mindfulness in schools and outcomes, teaching young people to breathe and having a connection to a safe place to manage their emotions and helping them understand emotions. I think social emotional learning is very important for young people. And again, back to the therapeutic order, help the body heal itself, help communities heal itself, and also being really careful when we look at some of the pharmaceutical interests. And I'm into harm reduction. I think Suboxone and some of our methadone, some of our other harm reduction treatments can be very helpful. But I think we also need to be really careful of some of the scripting by the drug manufacturers about their product, equating it to insulin as if you're going to need it for the rest of your life. To me, I push back on that. And I always like to say, don't trust the drug dealer. We did that with the opioids to start with. So I think we need to be really careful in our treatments that we can employ harm reduction, but we also need to make sure that we have the holistic aspects along with that. Our goal is cure beyond harm reduction. And I'm going to speed through here because I'm just finishing and wanted to make a couple more points. So often a whack-a-mole is kind of how we're facing things. And the opioid addiction, there's going to be new drugs. There's new drugs all the time that are being manufactured pharmaceutically. And we can't get ahead of it from a law enforcement perspective. And until we address upstream approaches and promote true holistic healing, we're going to continue to have a problem. We need to go to the source, treat the root cause. And sometimes it's very simple on certain pieces as far as healing, having loving relationships, having connection. And I don't have time to really go into depth with this article, but just really looking at sometimes our cognitive behavioral therapy, our approaches aren't culturally sound or based. And this is just talking about how in Rwanda, in some of the genocide that took place, some of our Western practices weren't culturally appropriate. And they're like, we have other ways, and, they are incredibly healing. And please value our cultural practices that also promote not only, us processing the trauma, but also deep healing, profound healing that are connected to our ancestral ways and healing. And for those of us who work with deep, dark issues and addictions, we always have to be careful that we maintain our personal well-being. That it can affect us and get into us, and sometimes we become very jaded. That we need to be taking care of ourselves, and we need to understand that it's small changes make a big difference. This is my grandpa, Emil Gunderson. I started my career early on commercial fishing, and grandpa was an amazing teacher on the boat. And one of the things that he reminded me was, as I was steering the boat and I was oversteering, I was steering it like a car. He tapped my shoulder and he goes, hey, Gary, look behind you. And it was a big S, right? For those of us who've been on the water, and I was oversteering, and it was a profound realization that it just took small changes that can make a profound difference over time. And we need to celebrate those micro wins. We need to understand those small changes make a big difference over time. So I'm closing now with a couple of quotes. Doctor of the future will give no medicine, but will interest his patient in the care of the human frame and diet and the cause and prevention of disease. A very wise man, Thomas Edison. And Dr. Rita Blumenstein, again, this is a full quote. She goes, "We are free to be who we are, to create our own life out of our past and out of the present. We are our ancestors. When we heal ourselves, we also heal our ancestors, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, and our children. When we heal ourselves, we heal Mother Earth." And another one of my favorite people, Winona. And our next generation are counting on us. And we need to employ and invest in programs and services that reach them and help them stay healthy and address trauma early on. thank you, Kagasakun, for your time and attention. And I'm going to hand it back to our team here. Again, I apologize for going a little bit over. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Gary. We really appreciate your time. Great information. Seems like we have a few minutes here. If anybody has some questions that they want to put in the chat box. Otherwise, I can start on some closing information here. So please remember to fill out our evaluation survey. That'll be sent out to email addresses later today. And I'm going to see if we could try to get it in the chat box here as well. But if not, you will get an email after today's session. And I also want to just let people know about our next webinar on March 25th. It's titled Substance Use Treatment Perceptions and Experiences Among Men Who Have Sex with Men Who Use Crystal Methamphetamine. And that's going to be presented by Adam Vieira. And let's see here, we've got a few questions here, Gary. I'm just going to read these in the order that we received them. Do you have a prevention plan for medical marijuana or something similar?
Okay, could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Do you have a prevention plan for medical marijuana or something similar?
So I'm trying to fully understand the question. So using medical marijuana and a prevention plan. So cannabis treatment, I mean, of course, 1 in 10 people who use cannabis become addicted. At least that's the current research that I've seen. So I'm always careful with cannabis as a treatment, but I also feel like it does have, other properties, like CBD has been very hot in the news as an anti-inflammatory without the psychoactive effects. And even the psychoactive effects being helpful for some medical conditions, which I feel like there's definitely a lot more research that has to go into cannabis over time as we use it for like healing trauma, for example. I think there are some promising studies using cannabis and also psilocybin in a medical situation. So I feel like there's definitely promising research in some hallucinogenic drugs that have often been demonized. That there are some therapeutic aspects to them, but I also want to exercise caution, saying sometimes I think the research hasn't caught up with us yet, and so I'm hopeful for more direction from those who are doing the research as to appropriate use of cannabis as a therapeutic tool. So that's about as much as I have to say on cannabis.
Great, thank you. I think the rest of these are mostly comments just saying terrific information, and thank you, Gary. We appreciate your time. So it looks like that's all we have room for today. So thank you, Gary. We appreciate your time, great information, and thank you everybody for attending.
Kagasakun, thank you so much for having me, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
You too, take care.